Good afternoon now. It's a little bit after 12, so good afternoon. I'm not used to saying good afternoon to most of you. My name is Mike Solberg, and I am the senior pastor here at the Union Church of Hinsdale, and it is a delight to welcome all of you here today for this panel discussion about media truth and faith, and it is, of course, a very timely topic in the midst of our society. We all know that there is a renewed questioning of media in our culture today, coming from not only the president, but from all sorts of people across the political spectrum are all wondering, what is this journalism thing, and how does it function in the world today? And who are the people that do this? And are they real people? Or are they actually just like automatons? Well, we're here to show you, to prove to you that they are real people, and we are so excited to have these three with us today. Trish Callahan is a investigative reporter and newspaper writer and a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and has done some really fabulous stuff, and she has the kind of job that I just really admire, because investigative journalism is incredibly important and difficult to do. And Dick Johnson, who is a member here, of course, at Union Church, and maybe you've seen him on TV. NBC, NBC5. Dick is an Emmy Award winner and has done some really amazing work in his field through, 5 or 10 years you've been doing this, maybe?
Couple.
Yeah, okay, great.
Very tired now.
Yeah, very tired. And Jennifer White is one of the news people at WBEZ, NPR-related radio in Chicago. And Jennifer's also done some really fantastic things. She's one of the people that when I hear her on the radio, I listen to NPR a lot and BEZ a lot. And so it's always great to know what she's doing, the kind of stuff that they're approaching. And each one of these fields, of course, we did this intentionally because print journalism and TV and radio all have different ways of approaching the craft of journalism, and yet each of them is an incredibly important part of our society today. And we're going to try to just think through a little bit today how all of that works. Again, one of the goals here is to let you know that these are the people behind the stories, and they are real people, and they carry with them many of the same kind of concerns that you have or would have if you were doing their jobs. And so we really want that to come across today. One last bit before I be quiet and we can hear the people that you really want to hear talk, and that is that if there are any more kids in the room who want to take a break at some point, Penny Johnson, who just left. One of us, either Bromley or one of us, will make sure that Sweeney, maybe you're the only ones left. If you want to go, you probably know where to go, so you'll take care of it. So thank you very much for coming, and I'm just going to have them introduce themselves. We told them each to take, about 5 minutes to introduce themselves and their work, and we'll go right to it. So please welcome them. Is there an order? Okay, you all have microphones, and so whoever starts talking first looks like Mr. Johnson is.
Well, the women to my right and left have just appointed me first to go, so I'll be short and sweet, because I know many of you. I have been a reporter and an anchor in TV news since 1976. Long time. Yeah, I've been in Chicago with both ABC7 and NBC5 since 1982. So, and I've covered every president, every mayor in my lifetime here in Chicago. I interviewed a lot of people, did a lot of investigative reporting, and now I do a lot of anchoring. And it's basically reporting from the news desk, I call it. I love what I do. I love getting up every morning and doing what I do, which is what I preached to my kids when I was raising them. Find something that gets you out of bed and you love to do in the morning. It is very hard work. It's probably harder now than it's ever been, largely because of the criticism we receive from all parts, and the skepticism we receive about what we do, and people's reticence about even talking to us or allowing us into their lives to tell their story. But we do, and we sometimes have to play social worker sometimes when we're interviewing people and coming into their lives, but we're trying to represent the entire community that we serve and the best to our ability, to the best of our ability. We'll get into more details later, but that's my life in a nutshell. I'm married and have 3 kids.
All right, I'm Trish Callahan. I've been at the Chicago Tribune, investigative reporter at the Chicago Tribune for 13 years. And before that, I was at the Wall Street Journal. And I've worked pretty much all over the country before that, and for a while was even based in Southeast Asia. So I started, because I'm a print person and I'm not used to talking in front of people, I have a few slides that I wanted to run through because I thought it might be easier to explain what I do by showing some of the work. And then if we have time, I can also show you some of the fun things I do, which I have a little mini lesson on how to unmask a front group. So if anybody's interested in that, we'll see if we have time for it, I don't know. But this up here you see, let the people know the facts and the country will be safe. That is actually etched into the wall at the Tribune Tower. I've passed it every day for 13 years, and it seems like a really prescient thing in today's world, and interesting too that it was said by a Republican. So I think to a certain degree this shapes what a lot of us, what we do really. And if you don't mind switching to the next slide, I'll walk you through the most recent project I did, which just ran back in November and December, and we're still doing some follow-up stories on it. But this was what I do is a little bit different than what a lot of reporters do at the Tribune in that I don't have a beat. So a beat reporter is somebody who specializes in one thing, say the Cubs or Chicago Public Schools or a particular aspect, say retail businesses. I write about pretty much anything as long as there's an investigative focus there, as long as there's some injustice that needs journalism to expose it. And I'm lucky in that I often spend 6 months to a year, sometimes more, on one story. And that's all I do. So it's an amazing job, really. I mean, I can't think of anything more fun than this. And I say fun, but a lot of what I look at isn't fun at all. It's actually full of sorrow and misery, and this is an example of it. I feel like as journalists, and as people really, pretty much all faiths call us to look out for the least of those among us. And this project is an example of that, in that we were exposing how the state of Illinois was steering adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities into cheaper, privately run group homes, and then cloaking harm and death with secrecy and silence. So there are really terrible things happening to really vulnerable people around our state. And this series of stories sought to expose that. And it was hidden for a long time. If you don't mind switching to the next slide. When I say hidden, here are some of the documents that we got from the state to give you a sense of the uphill battle we have, right? Those are, I didn't redact those. That's how they came to us from the state. So when I say that some of these things, it's really hard work to get to the truth of the matter, this is what we're up against, all right? Here are some examples of what we were hoping would shed light on what was going on in the group homes, and here's what we faced. So next slide, please. So how do we get around that? It was like an information black hole. We got around that by filing over 100 Freedom of Information Act requests. So that's why sometimes these stories, that particular series took on and off about a year, and it was another colleague and I full-time on it. And we had to just seek ways around those information roadblocks. And next slide, please. In the end, I feel like when you let the people know the facts, there are more good people in the world than bad, and when you expose an injustice, people will demand change. And I've been lucky enough to see that happen time and time again. You point out an injustice, and people will step up to the plate and say, let's fix this. And oftentimes, in the case of this series, it was critical of both the current administration, the Rauner administration. There were critical pieces about them, and about the Quinn administration, and even the Blagojevich administration. They all played some role in this. And I remember a reader discussion, a lot of that happens online or through letters to the editor and such, where there were people talking about kind of the finger pointing, who was really to blame here. And I remember one reader wrote in and just said, you know what? I don't care who is to blame, just fix it. And I do feel like when you present the facts to people, there is, and it becomes kind of an impetus for change, and that is really, I think, what buoys a lot of the work that we do. And if there's time, am I running out of time? Because I can do the front group thing. Do the front group thing, okay. If you don't mind the next slide. So it's hard to talk about, when we were talking about truth, I was like, I gotta talk about the flame retardant story. This was one we did where I have to say, in my quarter century of doing this, I have never come across such outright deception as this story. So as a journalist, the opportunity to just peel back deception is rare, and for what I do, it's kind of fun to be able to kind of unmask a front group or expose that type of injustice. This was a story at its core about something that sounds kind of boring, upholstered furniture, right? not very exciting. But it was about, it was much more than that, but it was about how the furniture in our homes is packed with toxic flame retardant chemicals. These chemicals are linked to all kinds of health harms: cancer, neurological problems, impaired fertility, and a number of other things. And it wouldn't really matter, right, because we don't eat our furniture, but they're volatile chemicals, so they migrate out in dust, and though we don't like to think about ingesting dust, we do it on a daily basis. And so scientific studies show that we in the US have among the highest levels of flame retardant chemicals in our body than anywhere else. And our children have 3 times the level as adults, because you think about it, they play on the floor, they put things in their mouth, they put their hands in their mouths, and so they are far more exposed than even we are. So that was interesting to me, and I kind of wanted to know why that was. Why are these chemicals there? And when I approached the story, when somebody originally told me about it, a scientist told me about it, and I said, yeah, I get it. That sounds a little alarming, but at the same time, I don't know about you, but I'm afraid of fire. So I don't want to burn up in a fire. If these things are helping us, then maybe that's a trade-off that we can live with. In reality, as I got into this story, I found out they do not, the level of the flame retardants in our furniture in our homes, which as opposed to being measured in parts per million, parts per billion, they're measured in ounces and pounds. So there's a lot of these things in our furniture at home. And they don't work. They don't work as promised. The scientists whose studies the chemical industry was holding up to show, hey, these things are great, they protect us from fire, they give us more escape time, that scientist said, they have grossly distorted my work. And by the time the fire gets to the polyurethane foam in your couch, gets to those flame retardants, the fire just laughs at it. So here we had a buildup of toxic chemicals in our homes and our bodies, and they don't work. And I wondered, boy, why is that? If you don't mind going to the next slide, and we might speed by that one. That's it. Actually, if you want to know if they're in your couch at home, just pick up a cushion. You'll see a tag like that. That means there's flame retardants in your couch. Next slide, please. So this is why they were in there for decades. I'll skip the part about the tobacco industry. It's fascinating, but I'll go on too long. This was the reason why they remained there after a broad coalition of groups tried to get them taken out, tried to get laws changed. Scientists, pediatricians, groups of mothers, because they show up quite frequently in breast milk. A broad coalition of groups was trying to get the law changed to take flame retardants out of our furniture, or to make it so that furniture makers weren't forced to use them. And it was this group, Citizens for Fire Safety, that was going around the country fighting those efforts. And you can see, right, 5 smiling children, the little banner with the heart dotting the I, and you got a fire station that could have been on any corner in America. And it describes itself as this broad group, right? And they would show up and make the concerns of firefighters who are actually opposed to the flame retardants, because they wind up with more of these in their bodies than anybody else. And all these other groups seem sort of petty. If you don't mind flipping to the next slide. This was their star witness, David Heimbach. He was a doctor at the University of Washington. He's a star burn surgeon, and he would go around the country to any place where there was legislation being proposed that would scale back the use of flame retardants, and he would tell these gripping tales about babies who had been burned terribly. And it didn't matter how many firefighters stood up and talked about it, or how many nursing mothers, or how many pediatricians, or how many scientists to say, hey, what he's saying isn't true. He had the room in his hand. I mean, this guy really knew how to tell a story. And who's going to vote, for a bill that seems like it's going to hurt, it's going to kill babies, right? No one wants to do that. So the laws would go down in flames, no pun intended. And so the group behind him was Citizens for Fire Safety. They would pay for his travel and pay for his expenses. So I wanted to know, well, who the heck is Citizens for Fire Safety? Are they really that, Americana group that they're claiming to be? If you don't mind the next slide. So I started with their federal tax form. This is, every nonprofit in America has to file one. And the first thing that caught my eye was a standard charity that you think of as a 501c3. If you look under that same as above, you'll see the box for 501c6 is checked. A 501c6 is actually a trade group. So that was intriguing to me, number one. And if you look underneath, it says what their purpose is. Their primary purpose is to promote the common business interests of members involved in the chemical manufacturing industry. So right off the bat, I knew I had a story that at the very least they're a trade group, but are they a front group is the question. If you go to the next slide, when I want to figure out if something's a front group, what I want to know essentially is it founded, funded, and controlled by a group that's different than what it's pretending to be? And so those are 3 kind of high bars to clear if you want to describe that. So on the left, you'll see the Articles of Incorporation in the state of Delaware. It was founded by a woman named Barbara Little, okay, and it gives an address in Washington, D.C. It doesn't say what she is. On the right, you'll see the Federal Senate lobbying form for Barbara Little, and it turns out, lo and behold, she's one of the chief lobbyists for Albemarle, which is among the 3 largest companies that make flame retardants in the world. So we got that. It's founded by a senior leader in the flame retardant industry. Next slide. It's funded on its federal tax form, it shows by membership dues. Okay, so, but what if its members are this big broad group of people, right? What if there really are fire chiefs and other groups that are part of that? Then I don't know that I could say that it was really solely funded by the flame retardant industry. Next slide, please. So the members, though, thankfully, the state of California, where this group did a fair amount of lobbying, you have to file this really obscure form. And if your trade group has less than, I can't remember if it's 25 or 45 members in it, you have to file this form and you have to disclose who your members are. So on the right, you'll see, who are the members of Citizens for Fire Safety? It's Chemtura, Albemarle, and Israeli Chemical. Those are the 3 largest makers of flame retardant chemicals in the world. So the last question is, all right, so we know it's founded, we know it's funded, but what about who controls it now? So if you slip to the next slide, please. Controlled, sure enough, here's the back to my favorite form, the 990, the federal tax form. The folks who are on the board calling the shots, they're all members of the flame retardant industry. They're all senior executives. So we knew it was founded, funded, and controlled, if you don't mind flipping to the next slide. So that group up in the corner, that's what they were pretending to be. The shot on the right is a picture that my colleague took hanging out of a plane going over the, I can't see from the couch, I think that's Chemtura's plant in Arkansas. So that, but as you can tell, that took a lot of time to figure out, to kind of get to the bottom of the truth, and it's essentially what we do. If you don't mind flipping to the next slide, the benefit of that is, again, let the people know the facts, and a ton of reform came about because that the law that was responsible for flame retardants being in your couches was changed radically. There's no longer a need to put them in. California was responsible for that, but it had become a national standard. It started long dormant talks in the Senate about reforming the way that we regulate industrial chemicals in America. That started that process and ultimately led to an overhaul of the toxic chemical, federal toxic, I forget what it's called, but anyway, the federal rule for regulating toxic chemicals. The front group folded, Citizens for Fire Safety no longer exists, and that burn surgeon surrendered his license to practice medicine. So, you know, it takes a lot of work, but I think when you expose the truth, people will run with it and potentially bring about change. So, thanks. Sorry, that was longer than I thought.
I don't have slides. I'm a radio person. My name is Jennifer White. I've only been in Chicago for about the last year. Before coming to WBEZ, I was at Michigan Radio, which is the NPR affiliate based out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. It's part of the University of Michigan. I've been in public media, radio and television for, I did the math this morning, it's been about 18 years, which is surprising, but it's been a great career. For those who aren't familiar with NPR, it's National Public Radio, and it's a nonprofit radio organization based out of Washington, D.C. with member stations across the country. We call them member stations because the way the model works is each member station is responsible for its own budget. So we raise the majority of our budget from member donations. About 60% of WBEZ's budget comes from individuals, and not one big individual giving us millions of dollars. The majority of these people are people who are contributing $10 or $20 a month. We use that money from some corporate support. We don't have commercials on our station. We have what we call underwriting, grants from foundations and other nonprofit organizations, and then we get some money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is federal money, but that's a very, 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 very small portion of our budget. On the television side, it's a little different. Television is more expensive. Public television stations tend to get a larger share of that CPB money. So then we send that money, some of it, to NPR, and in exchange for programs like Morning Edition and All Things Considered. So at WBEZ, I am an anchor and host. I occasionally host some of the news magazine shows like All Things Considered. I don't do Morning Edition. It's way before my waking up time in the morning. But I'm also one of the hosts of Morning Shift, which is our daily affairs program. It's at 9 o'clock in the morning, and unlike Trish, who gets to spend, 6 months to a year, that's just incredible in a story, we have 3 to 4 segments a day, and this is live radio. So what you do is you prepare, you do as much reading as you can, you prep as many questions as you think you need, you try to get as much background information as you can, then you open up the microphone and you just go for it. It's trying to do checks and balances in real time, which can be a challenge, especially when you're dealing with, I hate to say it, but politicians. And so you have a team of people, producers who are also behind the scenes, also kind of helping you fact check in real time. Before I came here and I was at Michigan Radio, we were engaged in one of the biggest stories to come out of Michigan in a long time, and that was the Flint water crisis. I was able to do conversations around that subject, and it was a really good reminder for why I went into this work. One of the most compelling stories I did was with 3 mothers from Flint. And we'd been doing a lot about what was happening on the policy side, what was happening at the legislative level, you know, how people were trying to address it or not address it. And we were in a news meeting one day, and I said, we haven't really spoken to parents. Like, what are moms doing every day to get their kids out of the door? How are they cooking? How are they bathing their children? How are they just living day to day? So we were able to identify 3 mothers, and I sat down and spoke with them for about 90 minutes. And talking to them and giving them a chance to just talk about what it's like to live through this crisis, to live with the fear, to know that your child may have been affected by lead poisoning, which is incurable, which will have long-term effects. And these were 3 mothers from different walks of life. One mother was dealing with a chronic illness. One mother had been homeless for a while. But hearing those voices and bringing those voices to air moved it beyond this policy-level discussion about where things went wrong to reminding people that behind all of these stories, behind the policy, behind the politics, there are people. And that's why I went into radio and why I went into public radio specifically, because I feel like that's a strength for us, bringing people to the politics and the policy discussions. So that's my story. I think we can go from there.
If I could just clarify real quick on the donor-operated WBEZ versus the business-owned and operated Tribune and NBC, I also, and I think you also, probably got into the business as a public service to help others in need and to expose stories. But, and the fact is, we are owned by NBC Universal Comcast. You were owned by the Tribune for the moment, anyway. Trunk, yes, the clever, not so clever acronym Trunk. But the truth is, there is an imaginary, very thick wall between the journalists in our building and the business side. I don't know anything about sales, don't care about, I obviously want us to thrive and succeed and have viewers. You want to have readers, and that's the only way you can survive. But we really, day to day, have nothing to do with the business side and are never influenced in what we do by the business side, even though people believe just the opposite.
Who owns you, Dick? My name is Bradley McClenaghan. I'm the associate pastor here, and I am so delighted to get to be a part of this panel. I dreamed of being a journalist in college before redirecting my pursuits, and now I get to talk to a captive audience, right, every week. But it is my great joy to be with you and to ask some of these questions about media and truth. And so we've sort of come up with some things that we thought might direct our conversation. We'll spend a little bit of time then where I'll pose a question and ask whoever is inspired to respond, to do some reflecting on it. And then in a little while, we'll open it up for questions from the group gathered here. So my first question for you is around this. Depending on which poll you look at, Americans have varying degrees of trust in the government and the media, and certainly the church. That trust, according to one poll, is also currently split along party lines, as we sort of mentioned. So how, in your estimation, did we find ourselves in this moment? What makes your work trustworthy? Any advice or criteria you can offer to those of us gathered here about how to determine the reliability of a source? If you don't have 6 months to go through all their tax documents, what else, which is awesome, I would love to do that. So please.
I'd like to address the trust question. It's something that, oddly enough, I've been thinking a lot about because of Oprah Winfrey. We did a podcast documentary series recently on the history of the Oprah Winfrey Show. And what has happened is that media has become so splintered that it is easy for each of us to self-select outlets that basically echo back what we want to hear, that echo back our worldview to us. At the height of its show, the Oprah Winfrey Show was getting about 40 million viewers a week. Right. If anyone pulled that off in television today, or really in anything today, it would be a miracle. It doesn't happen anymore, but there were fewer choices. So between the split in cable television, the number of radio stations that are on, the internet, we get to self-select what we want to hear. Now, how does that fit into trust? Well, if you're only hearing one voice, if you're listening to this one voice who's telling you this certain set of ideas, and it's what you want to hear, if you then turn the channel and you hear someone else saying, well, that's all not true, that's all a lie, what do you believe? How do you know who's telling the truth and who's not? And I think that adding to that is that the line between media and journalism has become Skewed. That's a good word for it. All media isn't journalism. And making the case for that has become increasingly difficult because there are networks, stations that call themselves journalism that aren't following the rules of journalism. And we don't spend our time calling out those stations and saying, well, they're not into this issue of trust we have nowadays. It's part of it is up to us, and how do we make the case that what we're doing is journalism and not just opinion. It's not just part of this media wave that's out there, but also for the listener or the viewer or the reader. If what you are consuming is only reflecting back to you your worldview, from my perspective, that's a good gauge that you might need to diversify your sources.
We call it siloing, or, a la carte menu choosing of your news. And it doesn't help, from my perspective at NBC, that we have MSNBC. And at night we have very partisan commentators. But I picture it, and I hope the public does too, as the editorial page, perhaps, of this particular journalism company. It doesn't reflect the reporters who are doing news coverage every day. It reflects the editorial, perhaps, spin of MSNBC in particular. Fox News has a similar problem. Fox News, mainstream Fox News, pretty much presents the news as we would over at NBC, fair and balanced to the best of our ability, whereas Fox News talk shows like the former Bill O'Reilly would go way to the extreme in terms of his point of view. And so the public in general, I think, we're identifying my company and that company as very extreme left and very extreme right and very extreme left. And if you polled any of our newsrooms, I think, you'd find an ideological, theological, and ethnic diversity, sexual diversity. We've got, I think we reflect, at NBC5 anyway, the audience that we serve in the city of Chicago. And to say that we're all liberal media is such a misnomer and such a slap in our face. And that we have a corporate spin on our stories every day is patently not true. We have no one dictating how we should do a story. We do it based on our journalism ethics and the ethics statements that we sign at NBC to be fair and balanced with everything we do.
I would just add to that to say, so the Chicago Tribune has an editorial page, and hopefully folks in the audience know this, but if you don't, the editorial page, the folks who do endorsements and write editorials on a daily basis trying to influence thought in town, is totally separate from the newsroom. And when I say it's separate, I really mean it. They're in a different area of the building. And when they're editorializing, even about, say they'll editorialize about one of my stories, I don't know what they're writing about. I have no say in that. I have no, until I read the paper like you would. So it really is separate. I run into people all the time who are upset about, oh, you endorsed this politician, or you didn't endorse that politician. And I was like, listen, I have nothing to do with that. Honestly, what I'm doing is totally different. And I think it's hard these days to realize that there's that separation. I think that all media is struggling with that, in different ways. But I would also, just to follow up on one of your later questions, was, what can I realize people don't have time to pull tax forms and go to 6 states to find these kinds of things, right? That's sort of what I do. But there are general questions that you can ask, that I ask people who I speak with, whoever I'm interviewing. When somebody calls up and says, I've got this great tip for you, I found out something, or even in scientists who came to me and said, hey, I think Citizens for Fire Safety, we think it's a front group. The first question I ask is, how do you know that? It's a really good question to ask of anything you're reading, anybody you're talking to who's presenting a particular view. How do you know that? It's not even a confrontational one, it's a curious one. I think particularly if you present it right. How do you know that? And And sometimes folks know that because they've done their homework and they've done research and they have, a good grounding in what they're talking about. And other times it's, because I heard it on, I read it in this place, or somebody, so-and-so told me that. And then, so you want to just go to the next thing and say, okay, well, how do they know that? And so I think that if we ask these questions more often, we can have more productive discussions about the source of things and who is influencing that. And I can tell you, based on my work, that there are some very, I guess because I come across this, there are some very sophisticated groups out there that are very good at manipulating the truth or presenting their particular view of things as though it were the truth, right? And that are paid a lot of money to do that. And so it makes my job interesting because I feel like there are a lot of them and they're pretty sophisticated these days, and it keeps people like me in business to get to the bottom of it, but it also makes it really hard to be a consumer of news and to know what is news and what isn't.
Just want to make sure we follow up on one little thing. Jennifer, you first mentioned journalistic ethics. So could you give us the 30-second elevator speech version of, what is journalistic ethics?
Wow, the 30-second elevator speech, that's a doozy. We recently went under some ethics training at our station, and it was different than what I was expecting. It was from the Poynter Institute, and you have some basics like fact checking. Someone says, as you said, this is what it is. Okay, well, how do you know that?
Well, the old City News Bureau saying, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out.
Right, exactly.
That's what we operate under.
But then I think we're at a time when we get into these more nuanced questions. Someone tells you this is a fact, and saying, okay, what is this person's agenda? Is there an agenda that's at play here? And if so, how do I make sure that agenda isn't driving my story? Another question, how will this issue affect the stakeholders? Does that matter? So we're at a time when it's not as simple as an elevator pitch. It's actually gotten a lot more nuanced, at least in our newsroom, which is the role editors play. So you do your story, or you've done an interview and you want to go back through and say, okay, did we miss something here? Do we need to follow up on this the next day? We have a team of people that include editors who say, okay, here's where we went the wrong way. We went left here, we should have gone right. We missed this issue, and then you follow up the next day. So I can't give you like an elevator pitch. I don't know if you have one.
Well, I guess I would also say, just to follow up on the great things that you said, is there are some very basic things like we don't participate in marches, right? We don't.
We are forbidden from having any placards in our lawn.
Exactly.
Or
some
signing
really
any
basic
petition
things.
or endorsing anybody publicly.
Exactly. We are allowed to vote. That's pretty much it.
But I do know journalists who don't vote.
We stay out of a lot of things.
Around this town, you never say who you vote for, though,
Exactly.
just out loud, just in
Exactly.
case.
And I have colleagues who actually don't vote.
No matter what you do for a living.
Some journalists don't vote. Some journalists don't vote,
Especially if they're covering politics, they don't
Yes.
vote. But the not signing petition thing, I have to say that can be, no, I'm sorry, I'm a journalist, can't do it. It gets me moving down the street. But I think in terms of, there are a lot of assumptions made about our beliefs, some of it based on our identity. I'm a black woman. So people meet me and make assumptions about where I stand on certain issues, and there's nothing I can do to control for that. The issue about marches came up recently at our station because some of the women in our organization were saying, well, I'm a woman. Why is it a political statement to be in a march that's about women? I want to take my daughter. But we're at a time when trust in journalism and in media is so fraught. We find ourselves erring on the side of caution more often than not.
Is there not a journalistic code of ethics? I don't know the organization that drafted it,
Society of Professional Journalists.
which is that you have to sign or
Absolutely. We just actually we have our own at the Tribune.
We do too, yeah.
Yeah, and it's many pages long and very specific. And we sign it every year. We just actually did it last week. And
We
you
have an
to
annual
disclose.
statement we sign every year that comes from, that's drafted by our corporation.
Exactly. And I'm just thinking of other practical things, like you can't own stock if in something that you might wind up covering someday, right? So a lot of journalists, you know, your retirement fund is in a mutual fund, and that's it.
You can't accept free tickets to...
No
that,
gifts.
You can't
of
accept
value.
any gift that a normal viewer or a normal person wouldn't be able to have access to, like, you know, free tickets to a theater performance.
Or if your spouse, for instance, my spouse worked in the energy industry. I
Right.
didn't do stories about the energy industry. So, and these are things that would be invisible to people, you know, but we err on the side of caution.
Yeah, it's just something we take seriously. And we had a similar discussion in our newsroom about the Women's March. And there were folks saying, you know, I mean, my daughter Helen's in the first row here, and she really wanted to go. You know, aren't we women? Don't we want to stand up with women? But it was seen as a partisan event, you know, and you just don't want to be, to carry that weight around with you. If someone sees you there in the, you know, and... or that you have to disclose it later. Hey, listen, I was there. I mean, at some point we might wind up writing about any number of those issues or any number of the politicians, and you can't control what's said at an event like that. Or
One more quick example, and this may be an extreme, but my oldest son's, one of his best friends, has just been appointed the executive chef at 16, the restaurant in Trump Tower. I would love to go eat in that restaurant and experience his food, and honestly, you know, I don't want people to, if ever, you know, there's cell phones and video everywhere. If somebody takes my picture going to Trump Tower, I know this sounds ridiculous, and my family thinks it is, but I don't want viewers to assume one way or the other that he's going in to support Trump Tower. The restaurant is not owned by Trump. It's owned by somebody else, but it's in his building. So that's a very extreme example, and I'm still wrestling with it.
But I hope that's encouraging for you. These are the sorts of mental acrobatics we go through, and we have these in-depth conversations in our newsrooms. It's not something we take lightly. So I hope that encourages you or in some way.
I should say especially now.
Yeah, especially now.
We have had a lot of discussions off the record in this audience, hopefully. Nobody will quote me on this. We've had a lot of discussions, company-wide meetings, newsroom-wide meetings about play everything straight. You know, we're a visual media, no snarkiness or raising eyebrows or whatever, because some of the stuff we're reporting is, you know, can be fairly ridiculous and out there and not factual, and we have to go for the facts, and that is why you see us using factcheck.org a lot. We actually have full stories from them now, just to try to make sure the viewer understands that we are going for the truth. We are not going to report anything that is not. We're going to try not to report those.
I would say two things. One, we have a standards editor. That's her sole job, Margaret Holt, is to both interact with readers, often upset readers, either from upset by the paper or something they see online. We have a responsibility to correct our errors promptly, and we take it really seriously at the paper. You'll see corrections regularly in the paper because people are human and they make mistakes, though we work really hard to fact check stories. Sometimes things get by us, and I think it's important to recognize that we correct errors when they happen. I was trying to think, you know, I've had, it's tricky sometimes to even have conversations with people about issues when we talk about ethics, because I've had, like on the flame retardant story, I had some group that was just really excited about the reform, and we're like, gosh, we're just so glad that you're on our side on this. And I had to say, like, I'm not on your side here. I hope you understand, like, I am on the side of the truth, right? And you know, if your group were to go off and do something deceptive, I'd be reporting about you too. It's not that we're on one side or another, and I think that's a really hard lesson for people, that we're really trying to come down on what are the facts, what is the truth here, and it's tricky.
I'm sorry, one other quick example that's very relevant, Bromley, I have to, and that is that people of all political ideologies watching us so closely that for the first time in my life, I've gotten 2 emails in 1 week, last week, from viewers who said, you said Mr. Trump, not President Trump. Why are you disgracing our president? And I had to reply, if you were listening closely enough, the first reference we always make is President Trump, which we did. And the second reference is Mr. Trump, which we did. So either they heard it from a friend or a neighbor, or they weren't listening very closely. We toe the line, you know, again, we're human. We toe the line to the best of our ability, believe me.
We also say oftentimes that sometimes you really know a story is fair when you just upset everyone.
And that's like ministry.
That's
You
my
know you're
favorite
doing
saying.
something
If
right
I piss
somebody's
off both
yelling
sides equally, I've done my job. Pardon me being crass.
No, but it's funny I don't think that we talk, I mean, every industry has its sort of own standards, right? And and set practices. And I think it's really important, because we don't always talk about, I mean, we hear all the time about ethics violations, but we don't always talk about the ways that, you know, groups of professional people with a job to do are sort of like working together to make sure that everybody in their, you know, community or organization is doing that. We also have, I appreciated what you said, Trish, about being on someone's side, particularly in this moment where it seems like everybody is, in certain circles we hear a lot about like being a good ally. In certain other circles we talk about, you know, how somebody's run amiss if they're too politically correct, right? There's this sense that like we're supposed to choose a side based on any number of things, but not be driven by what we discover or what we know to be true or whatever. So one of the things that I think, you know, you've been talking around is this sense of sort of how can we be objective and how are we making sure that we're being impartial, and I think that's really important. I wonder though, what does that mean? Does that mean sort of like always interviewing 3 people who are for and 3 people who are against? Is this like, you know, when you're writing your essays for 4th grade or freshman year of high school or whatever, you know, or what does objectivity and impartiality look like? Is part of your task to give sort of everybody the chance to say what they need to say and the rope to hang themselves with, or is it to kind of craft your story to elevate the voices that aren't being heard?
Nobody wants to touch that one.
I can. I will. All right. So, you know, investigative reporting is a little bit different on this front, and what we want to avoid is false balance, okay? That's something we talk about in journalism, is false balance. And a good example of this would be climate change, all right? Where for many years, journalists would do the on the one hand, on the other hand, when the science of climate change, there was great consensus among scientists that climate change is real, and it is caused by activities of mankind and womankind. And now there are a huge swath of the country that believes it's a hoax, and I feel like we, in the media, in the broad sense, are partly responsible for that. And I happen to be involved in a documentary film. The flame retardant stuff just played a tiny little role in it, but it was really fascinating to see. It was primarily about climate and about groups that were spinning kind of deceptive messages about climate change and how sophisticated they were, where, say, I'm forgetting IPCC, I forget the name, the acronym, but it's, you know, essentially the world scientific body that comes up with the report about climate change every year. And to show you just how sophisticated the climate denial groups were, they came up with a report that looked literally like the exact same report. So in other words, it had the same blue cover, the exact same font. They said, you could hold them up next to each other, and they said, we made sure that we had exactly the same number of pages. So it was a, you know, alternative facts, if you will, right, of the side, and it was made to look in parity like that. So that's the idea of false balance, is to make sure that in things that are settled, if we're investigating something, obviously we always let people know this is what we're writing about. We welcome their comments. We incorporate their comments. We make sure that people who are the subject of an investigation, their side is heard. But investigative story is a little bit different in that there are findings. There are, we will say, this is a deceptive campaign by industry, or, the state shrouded these deaths in secrecy and silence. Those are declarative statements, and if I do my job right, you will walk away knowing through exhaustive research how we came to those conclusions. It's different than a typical news story, though, where you do want to hear, both sides of things. And
the problem is, as news consumers, it's difficult for you to know, because people can, as we know from conspiracy theorists about the assassination, about 9/11, about space travel, that you can cherry pick facts to fit your scenario and present it present those cherry picked facts as the whole picture and convince people. And one of my kids actually became quite convinced that 9/11 was a conspiracy perpetuated by the federal government. And I went ballistic with him, trying to say, how can, look at this. And he quickly came around when he looked at the other facts that he had missed in his, whatever he read online someplace. But because we have all this access to social media and so many news outlets that are legitimate, mainstream, not lamestream news organizations, and then we have all these other folks who pretend to be journalists or blog writers, you have to look behind the blog writer and see who is that person, what are their credentials. I'd like to quote quickly our leader at NBC News, Lester Holt, who says, he's on the subject a lot, and he said, you can't tweet away and you can't insult away decades of integrity in our organization and your organization and your organization.
So the reason I paused when you asked that question is because this issue of objectivity has been something we've been talking about a lot. Whether it's possible, because each of us carries our life experiences with us wherever we go, into our work included, whether it's necessary, whether the public expects us to be completely opaque about certain things. As I said earlier, the fact of the matter, I'm a woman. I'm a black woman. There are certain assumptions that will be made about where I stand on certain issues. So do I try to project objectivity or impartiality? And I think that's a discussion that a lot of us are having, and I think it's an active discussion right now in newsrooms. When we approach the work, like I said, I can't control for assumptions that will be made about what experience I bring to the work, but what I can do is ensure that the voices we have on any given segment are reflective of the different perspectives around an issue. That doesn't mean that there are two sides to an issue either. It's either this or this. Sometimes there are 3 or 4 sides, and sometimes you can't cover it in one segment. Sometimes you have to come back and say, yesterday we heard from these people, but here's another perspective on this question we're asking. We've gotten into this very binary approach to these difficult conversations when it's often necessary to have more than just this or this. There can be 5 different perspectives. I think the election's a really good example of that. There were these broad statements made about who voted for either side, but when you look behind the numbers and you start to see that, well, people may have voted for this individual, but it wasn't because of the reasons you thought, or it was a little bit of this, but it was also some of this, And so the onus is on us as journalists to try to bring these nuanced perspectives to you. But again, as a listener, viewer, reader, you got to be willing to do the work to dive into some of those nuances so that you get a more complete picture of any given issue.
Thank you. We're so lucky. This is very exciting. I think these are such pressing issues, and to hear you all reflecting, again, on the need for nuance and what makes this complex, but anything important is often complex, right? So to hear you reflecting on it is really wonderful. Thank you. We have sort of one more that we sort of head out, and then I want to open it up. I wonder if you would tell us maybe a little bit about what protections you think journalists need to maintain the sort of ethics and the freedom of the press that we purport to really value in this country. There was some, and now of course I can't cite my source for you, but we've talked a little bit about anonymous sources or funding streams that come from, certain more partisan media forms. What do we need to have freedom of the press?
I'll tackle the firewall issue. Prior to coming to WBEZ, which is a community licensee, that means the license is owned by a community, the board is made up of community members. I was at a university licensee. And so that meant that the University of Michigan held the station's license. And there were learning opportunities on both sides of the firewall, I'll say, when as a station we would report on what a big story was, but it may not be a story that was, made the university look particularly good. And there would, from time to time, be voices from the administration who would try to gently nudge us in any given direction. And so we had to establish a very strong firewall to say, we know you hold our license. We understand that. But if you value us as an independent journalistic organization, stay on that side. And if you don't, then we're going to have to divest. Now, what's interesting is that that station was one of the largest sources of individual donations at the university, just in terms of the sheer number of people who were contributing to that station. They did an analysis of the amount of soft money the station brought to the university, just in terms of the number of mentions of the University of Michigan on the air. Not because we were doing that, it was just, there's this interesting piece of research, or there's this story over here that we're covering, and it was in the millions and millions of dollars. The university was getting a soft benefit from us that they had to recognize, but it required them to stay on that wall, on that side of the wall. Now also, as an organization that's not for profit, because we're not watching the bottom line, we've got to make sure we can pay our bills, but we don't have to worry about influence from any big donor or from a corporate entity, but it's so important to the kind of work we do. We get calls from time to time from someone saying, I'll never give you another dime before because you had this person on the air. We're okay with that. We're okay with that because we have enough people who are willing to contribute to the station to protect our editorial independence. And that's one of the reasons why I deliberately chose to work in public broadcasting.
Well, clearly, we have to protect the First Amendment. That's an obvious. But we also have to protect the Freedom of Information Act, which helps Trish do her work, and us, we have the largest TV investigative unit in Chicago, us do our work. Without that, you would not have known about you wouldn't have not have known about Barbara Byrd Bennett and the Soups scandal. She was just sentenced this week. You wouldn't have known about Laquan McDonald. You wouldn't have known about Rod Blagojevich or Governor Ryan, because we were able to get documents like that, heavily redacted, and start there and move forward. And actually, I think this is the first time we met in person, but you and I have been working on another story for the last couple of years that may never see the light of day. But we do that often. We find ourselves at similar places going, oh, you're working on this too. But this is a very complicated thing, and I'm not going to go into it now that I've piqued your interest. But yeah, no, I wish I hadn't gone there, but it may not be a news story ultimately. Anyway, but we need, and there are many other tools that you use that if closed to us, or if Freedom of Information Act never came to be, we could not do what we do.
Absolutely, and there are also things called shield laws, which help people, help reporters protect anonymous sources. I'm actually unusual in my profession that I'm not huge on anonymous sources. I rarely go fully off the record with people. Other reporters have a very different approach to that, but those laws are very important. I would say actually one of the biggest fundamental challenges, and maybe it's just the print side of things, right? But what keeps me up at night well, other than the Freedom of Information Act, which is really important, and boy, we need a stronger Freedom of Information Act in Illinois. There are times where I feel like that's the case. But what keeps me up at night really is the financial future of independent media in general. At least a third of my 13 years at the Tribune, the company was in bankruptcy, under bankruptcy protection. And I worry about this on a regular basis. How are we going to support, I mean, what I do is probably the most expensive thing the paper does, right? There's not, you know, there are a number of us there that do it, but spending a year on a story, or having 2 reporters spend a year on a story is expensive. And so it's really important both to figure out a way to fund that and also figure out a way to keep the audience, right? If people just drop their subscriptions for whatever reason, they're upset about an endorsement, they don't feel like the paper's very relevant anymore. I mean, what good is a huge investigative story if nobody reads it, right? So building audience is really key. And I think in the future, you're probably going to see, we've seen a fair amount of this, but I think you're probably going to see a lot more joint ventures, a lot more collaboration between media. I feel like investigative and reporting in general, when I started out this, 20 years ago, we were really fiercely competitive with every other person out there, and now I feel like, man, we're all like endangered animals at the zoo, and we got to just kind of root for each other. And so maybe I've mellowed as I've gotten older, but I feel like I cheer for and try and spread great work whenever I see it, no matter who's doing it, because I feel like it's so important to our democracy, it's so important to our society that it doesn't matter if it's the Tribune or any other place. It's just great to celebrate important journalism.
But I also think it gives us an opportunity to connect with audiences we don't connect with ordinarily. Public radio has a certain audience. Newspapers have a certain audience. Television has a certain audience. When we work together, it gives us an opportunity to tap into audiences that we wouldn't reach through our regular medium. And that's a place where we need to work a little harder, I think.
Absolutely.
We have about just over 20 minutes for questions, but as you're formulating, why don't we just applaud for these people a little bit more?
And you forget it, I won't ask another one. Anybody want to ask a question? Let's just go straight to it. Kathy, your hand went up first.
Do I have to stand up?
And remember, you're asking questions, not making statements.
My question is this: from whence does this so-called fake news emanate?
Well,
Is it social media? Is it?
Yeah.
Well, I guess it depends on the fake news, but there are some very sophisticated groups out there that's what they do for a living.
Yeah.
So
60 Minutes has exposed a couple of them very well, who made a lot of money off of generating fake stories. And, I didn't believe it. I was asking, we're all asking the same thing. Where are these stories coming from? And then 60 Minutes, and I think maybe one other organization tracked it down and exposed the people who were willing to be exposed because they knew it was over at that point for them, who wrote these fake stories that very much sounded credible to those who read them, and many people who read them, and they sold advertising on their site, and they made a lot of money in the process. That's where many of them started.
Yeah, so it's not just one group, one organization. There are multiple pockets of people who do this.
What's that?
Yes, over the internet. So here's the thing to remember.
Social media.
Before you share a story, try to find out if it's true, because what they rely on is people spreading these stories around. They rely on you sharing a link on Facebook or sharing a link on Twitter, because that gets more eyes on their website, which is how they make money through the advertising they have promoted on that site. So if you get, a odd-looking article from a friend or a cousin that you think is a little suspect, you might want to say, I did some Googling, did some Snopes research, and this isn't accurate. That's the only time I engage in any kind of discourse online, is when I see a patently false story.
Then there's quasi-fake news that comes along, like emails that circulated around about Nancy Pelosi and the taxpayers having to pay for her flights home to California once a week sometimes. And the exorbitant cost that is when she was Speaker of the House for a 727 or whatever, because it was a long distance flight, so they didn't have to stop and refuel, to send her back to California. Well, guess what? You know, we paid for Dennis Hastert to come back to Illinois. I mean, they're Speaker of the House, and that's a right they have. And you do not want to be flying with the Speaker of the House because they are third, you know, in line to become president if something happens. So they need to be protected in a secure flight, and they, you know, it's their right with that office to go home. That it's not fake news. Yes, we were paying for her, but it skews it so that look what the Democrats are doing for their people. What are the the Republicans would never do that. Well, in fact,
It's like a lack of context.
yes, lack of context. Thank you.
Yeah, but I just want to add that it's become more complicated than that, because fake news sort of started, I don't know, I mean, at least in public awareness like a year or more ago, and there were people who just literally make stuff up in order to put it on the internet, in order to sell ads. And then other people would pick it up and link to it, and they would, therefore, the source of it would make more money. But, and I don't mean this in a partisan way, but in the sense of this conversation, it's important to realize that when President Trump started accusing others of putting out fake news, that turned it into an entirely different thing. He was just making a point that he didn't like what they were saying, and he would call it fake news. So that's an entirely different thing than somebody who's like intentionally creating a story just to get clicks off the internet.
And then he went beyond that with his core audience and said, see all those people with cameras in the back? And he said this day after day after day. They're scum. The media's scum. Word for word.
Enemy of the people.
This is a man I spent an entire day with when he was building the Trump Hotel, who could not have been more gracious and more engaging with us. And all three of his children. Spent a lot of time with them. Really enjoyed them. This is the same man who's he needed us then because he was building the Trump Hotel and needed to sell the condominiums. Then he's campaigning for president and says something like that. And we're going, no, wait a minute. This is a two-sided field here. Come on.
I'd like to ask about digital natives. I am obviously not one, but my kids are. And there's a very different way that they obtain information than I do. Do you have any thoughts about this generation's absorption of information?
My husband and I had actually talked about this on our way in, and how the way the younger generation seems to consume news now, it's in much smaller bites. And I actually will not limit that to younger people. I think there are a lot of people now who read the headline. You can sort of scroll through a bunch of search results or just read the first couple of sentences of a story and think you understand the story. And it's a challenging issue for us because you want to capture younger viewers, readers, listeners, but you want to do the work correctly. And I guess my advice to you would be, if you have young people in your life who seem to be doing this sort of headline grabbing thing, and you're consuming news in a different way, a more comprehensive way, talk about it. At dinner, have conversations. Challenge what they say. Let them challenge what you say. But have the conversation that forces them to think behind that headline, behind those first couple of statements, behind those bullet points or the listicle that they just consumed. That's what I would say. We did a lot of talking like that around my dinner table when I
Even
was
with
growing
young
up.
writers, we say, I preach context. Give me, why should I care about this story when I'm anchoring the news? Because often those stories are written, I will be sort of managing editor and edit them. Why do I need to care about it? Historically, give me some context that makes this meaningful. With my kids, I say, look at context, look at the depth, a deeper look at this story. But social media has drastically changed what we do and what you do, I think, to some extent. And that is that you all know what the big stories of the day are. I only work on the 10 o'clock news, that typically those are the newscasts I'm on. And our challenge is we have to take maybe that same big story and give you something you don't know. Because otherwise, you have no need to watch us. And likewise with the newspaper, the next morning, my God, it's even more challenging because we know everything we think that's happened, but you can go perhaps a few more paragraphs into the particular person that was a protagonist in that story, or some background we didn't know and enlighten us. And the Trib does it so well. And likewise.
What's interesting too is I think what surprised me was how little overlap there is between the print audience at the Tribune and the online audience. That was surprising to me. I figured, I'm a total news junkie, so we subscribe to 4 different newspapers. We listen to NPR all the time. We watch our nightly newscasts. So we're not the typical consumers of news in our house, right? But I think having kids, we talk about the being a good consumer of news, being a critical consumer of news, and what are your sources? What are, this same question I talked about earlier is how do you know that, right? And you can ask that of the stories that you're reading, right? They won't necessarily answer back, but you can look with a critical eye at what you're finding online, and as Jennifer said, be careful about what you're sharing, making sure that there's a foundation of truth there.
This is a question that was sparked by a couple of comments that Dick and Trish made. With regard, and full disclosure, I am Jennifer's husband, so.
Full disclosure.
Sorry, former journalist, so.
Did she give you this question and answer?
She did not plant, this is not fake news. No, this is not fake news.
Alejandro, is she paying you to be here?
The issue with respect to truth in news is coming into question every day when we look at what's happening at the national level and local levels. I'm curious about your thoughts regarding the responsibility of journalists and the media in general to call a lie when it in fact is a lie. And Trish, when you spoke about the issue of climate change, indisputable facts are truths, I would suggest. And when influential personalities say something to the contrary, what is the responsibility of news organizations and journalists to not say those are alternative facts, but in fact say that's a lie?
Well, we were slow to the table in pushing back on that kind of thing, I would say. We as an industry were, because we were on our heels when this administration began. And it began very simply with the inauguration crowd figures. I mean, we were like, first of all, why are we caring? And, Sean Spicer's completely unglued appearance before he even had his first press conference with the media, we were all like, what is going on here? And why do we care so much about crowd size? He was inaugurated, it all was very nice, and you're president. But it got to be we were pushed so much about that issue, we had to trot out the pictures. And pictures don't lie. I mean, we really were on the defensive in such a big way. And then eventually realized, okay, this is a different way of operating. It's a different playing field. And we're going to have to step up our game, not retreat. And if one of our own is picked on in a news conference as being the purveyor of fake news, we have to defend our industry. And it's really changed how we approach covering the White House.
I have to say that I say this so often in my stories that sometimes my editor will joke, like, can we say that again? Like, is that, like one of my favorite sentences, that's not true. Something very simple, like, pointed out, here's what the scene of something like, that's not, the only problem was, that's not true. So I say it all the time in the kind of reporting I do. I think what's trickier is when it's on deadline and my colleagues who have to make those decisions on the fly and do the kind of, if it's something simple like climate change, yeah, you can just stick in a that's not true, right? And I'd like to see, I'm hoping we see more of that, I think we do. But when it's something that requires more of that type of research, it's really hard to do that on deadline. And so I'm trying in the newsroom to turn as many folks in the newsroom as possible into kind of fellow document geeks and train them in how to find quick sources of documents that can show whether something's true or not, right? But
We simply don't have the time to do it
Yeah.
fast enough. Our investigative stuff is all vetted by our legal team in New York before it ever sees the light of day. After it's been written and edited and everything else, with day-to-day, hour-to-hour alleged facts, we can't fact-check them fast enough. So we try to present both sides, and if we're presenting the story at all, and say, this is what's been said, this is what others believe, or critics say this, and then the next day, if it's a big enough issue, we'll do a deep dive into it.
I would also say, and that's oftentimes where the Freedom of Information Act comes into play, right? When we think of Laquan McDonald, right?
Yeah.
That was, there were a set of facts that were presented originally by the Union for the Police Department, you know, and through, it was actually the Invisible Institute, a nonprofit journalistic organization that were sued, got the video, and we all now know that that was quite a different, you know, quite a different reality than what was seen. So I think sometimes we're in a position to be able to say whenever we can, that's not true. I think we should say it if we're very well grounded in saying that. I think it's something you got to be careful of. But I think we all hopefully are able to follow up on the bigger stories of the day. And if we can't get to the truth at that moment, that we can try and do some digging down the line and go back to the topics and make sure that if a different set of facts come out later, that we present it to people.
So just two really quick responses to what you asked. The first is that I think it's really important for a newsroom to have a clear set of standards. As a newsroom, climate change is real. So that's just a basic, and we're not going to equivocate about that. Same-sex marriage is the law of the land. We're not going to equivocate about that. So part of it is just having a strong set of understandings, like these are the things that are true. These are the things that are real, and we're not going to make a false equivalency around those issues. But around the use of the word lie, NPR has made a decision not to use the word lie in response to statements made by President Trump. And the NPR ombudsman came back and said there are both strengths and weaknesses in that position. The strengths in that position is that in using the word lie, which is a weighted word, you will automatically shut down certain listeners. It sounds judgmental. It sounds like an opinion, when in fact it may just be a statement of fact, that this thing that was said isn't true. That's the weakness in it, is that you, in using that word lie, you shut down a conversation. But sometimes a lie is a lie. And the issue is that by the dictionary definition of lie implies intent, that someone is making a statement they know to be false. And because we are not inside a person's brain, we can't judge whether or not they know what they're saying is false. They may believe it's true. So it's a very tricky place for us, the use of that word lie. I can't say that it will never be used on our air, but for now we are erring away from saying he lied and instead erring towards saying that's not true.
You know, it's interesting. I actually just gave a talk at a journalism school class solely about this issue of motive, and the big discussion was about when to use the word lie. And it is a really high bar because it does imply that you know what they're thinking. And sometimes, in very rare instances, you can get that because there might be a deposition or somebody says this is what I was thinking, but saying something isn't true, you kind of accomplish the same thing a lot of times, and you don't get into that. Well, I know that they were deliberately trying to misrepresent or distort. Sometimes you can because you've got a paper trail or a history of statements where somebody says, "Hey, I'm doing this on purpose," right? Yeah.
Let's go to another. Yeah, somebody in the back was first. Sorry, Bob. But
Well, I'm leaving.
I told him not to pick on me.
I'm just curious, you know, in the spirit of celebrating other journalists, there's some of these legends of journalism like Woodward and Bernstein, and just these, Dan Rather's doing a lot right now, but who would you guys recommend is the next generation of journalists that we should support and follow, who's going to, push our country forward through this?
I still have quite a few years to go.
There's no Woodward and Bernstein team that's emerged as celebrity journalist investigators lately that I recall.
That's a tough one.
Maybe movies will be made of Trish Callahan someday. But no, that's a tough one. I mean, I would support all of the folks in the trenches who are literally working day and night to give you the best possible news coverage that we can. And our guys at NBC, our younger guys, are on the road. They're never home. I mean, we have a sheet that's out every day of people who, the correspondents and their crews, and where they are and where they're going, and they work very hard to bring the truth to you. But we're TV, and we have a short 22-minute window and within a half hour to tell you what's been going on in the world. So much different than these folks who can go a little deeper.
Here's what I would encourage you to do is to really pay attention to local journalists, people who are doing work covering your community, covering your state. One of the most graceless beats, in my opinion, are the people who cover the state legislature. People who are covering the national political scene get a lot of attention, and you'll see them on different television stations. But when you really look at the issues that are affecting your life, the policies that are affecting your life, those are more often happening at the state level.
Yeah.
Pay attention to the people who are covering state politics, who are covering your senators, your state senators, and your state reps, and your mayor, and your governor. They will likely never get the kind of attention they deserve, but those are the people who are doing the work you should really pay attention to.
I have too many that I'm trying to think, who are my favorite journalists? I can't narrow the list. But I would say there are Woodward and Bernsteins out there. They're probably not as, I don't know if you would know some of these names, but David Barstow at the New York Times, phenomenal investigative reporter. I'm forgetting his first name. Farnthold is his last name, at the Washington Post, the guy who did the stories about President Trump's charitable giving. I thought that was really strong work. But there are a lot of phenomenal investigative reporters out at
in
local.
Chicago. I mean, really.
I think they're all over the country doing really terrific
incomparable work. I mean, Sun-Times, Tribune, DNA Info, but mostly the two newspapers. Without you guys doing what you do and somehow them affording to pay an investigative unit, we do investigative too, but not to the depth that they do in most cases. It's just phenomenal work, and I would celebrate these guys and buy their newspapers and read them, and then watch us as well.
Yeah, exactly. So one takeaway I would be is if you can.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. If you can, one takeaway from this would be, I would really encourage, if you want a vibrant media going forward, I would encourage all of you to, become members of WBEZ, watch your local newscast, and subscribe to a local newspaper. It doesn't have to be the Tribune. It can be whatever newspaper you want. But I think the challenge we have is that too many people are walking away and want to get their news for free. And it's become kind of a crisis in our industry as to how do we figure out a way to fund this going forward. There are new models emerging of kind of nonprofit models of getting groups of investigative reporters together who work across media and funding that through audience support and through foundations is one way of doing it. I think, the company is just trying to, we all in the media business in general, just trying to figure out a way financially to fund it, to make it work in the future. So whatever you can do to be good consumers of news and support news, all the better.
Ask after.
I didn't get to ask my question.
I'm sorry.
Who says I can't ask my question?
The lady with the mic.
Why the yellow jacket? Like a what?
I hope as we were putting this event together, I struggled a little bit to think about how to name why these questions were so important, in particular for religious people to ask. I mean, sure, we're concerned about truth, but particularly in this last sort of plug, to be smart, critical, paying consumers of news media, I think this really raises, for me, a reminder that we think and talk about public goods. What are things that are good for the world? And certainly the pursuit of truth, professionals following ethical standards in order to be fair and lift up voices and stories that need to be heard to protect us and challenge us and help us to live together, that is good and faithful work. And so we are grateful for your work and your time here with us. And I'm so grateful that you all came and spent this afternoon with us having this conversation. I hope that these sorts of questions will continue. Thank you again for being with us. And one more round of applause.